Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Mironova, and today I will be talking to you about environmental regulations, civil society, and extractive waste, the debate over Stocamine. I would like to start off by thanking a few of the people who made this project possible. First of all, it began in a course taught by Professor Michael Moffat of the University of Oregon Law School and the Clark Honors College, as well as Professor Muriel Rambourg of Université d'Alsace, as well as the International Atomic Energy Agency Liaison Officer for France, for both of their support in accessing some of the very valuable research materials that informed the present project. I would like to start off by introducing the research question, which was what has been the nature of civil society organizations' involvement in the effort to empty or destock the galleries of Stockamine? You can see bolded here two key parts. First is the civil society organizations themselves, who became the subject of this research, and then is the Stockamine facility, which is the case study I'm using. Stockamine is an extractive waste facility in the eastern part of France. The means and timeline of the storage and of the storage of waste in this facility have been the subject of heated debate over the past 2 decades. And specifically, the involvement of various groups, civil society organizations in this debate is what I'll be looking at. Speaking of Stockamine further, I want to introduce one of the framing tools that I used for this project, which is geography and the site's geographic location. As I mentioned earlier, we are speaking about France, specifically the region of Alsace. The site of Stockamine is located right here north of Mulhouse in a town called Wittelsheim, inhabited by 10,200 people. An important part about its location is that, as the map indicates, it's very close to both the Swiss and the German border, automatically implying that there's an international level of consideration should anything happen in this location. Further, its location in Alsace indicates that Alsace itself is a region that has a lot of potash mines. Potash is a potassium-containing type of salt. Whenever there is a lot of mining going on, you need an extractive waste site, hence the facility's existence. And finally, I wanted to show you a map of the town itself. Outlined here in red and in orange are the facility's surface installations and then the underground storage facility. Outside of providing contextual information, I think it's also important to introduce this geographical layer as it pertains to the sources of groundwater for the region. Outlined here on your right-hand side is the Upper Rhine plain, under which is the Upper Rhine aquifer. It is an aquifer that provides the water for approximately 3 million people who live in this region. And the site is marked here and here with a red dot. That that value of importance to the site's general location means that no action can be undertaken here without considerations of what it would potentially do to the alluvial water table, what are the risks of contamination, and so on. And that is something that will come to the fore with the Stockamine facility itself. Speaking of which, I want to further introduce the second framing tool, which is the temporal evolution of the site. It is first thought of in 1999, intended to be managed by a publicly owned company called Mines de Potasse d'Alsace, or MDPA, specifically its subsidiary, Stocamine, hence the facility's name. It's originally intended to be in operation for 30 years. At the end of the 30 years, it was thought that all of the waste would be removed. And I want you to remember that at this original stage, there was no intent for the waste to be indeterminately kept in these galleries. Speaking of which, you can see a schematic of the galleries on your right-hand side here. The site opens in 1999. It does not stay open for 30 years. Instead, it shuts down in 2002 when a fire breaks out. It takes several months to put out. Some of the workers that were in the galleries at the time are also exposed to asbestos and other toxic emanations. Stockamine will be found guilty for this, and several years later, this is a point at which facility is no longer in use. This is a point at which de facto it stops operating, even though there are other administrative stages that it goes through before being officially shut down. This is a point in which it is. And in 2007, MDPA is liquidated. And this is the first time when, outside of considerations of what to do with the fire, what to do with the facility's operation, will it be operational again? Instead, the question of what to do with the waste stored there is what becomes most important. I think this is also a good time to mention that the class 0 and class 1, according to influence law, um, chemicals that would to be stored there, classified as highly toxic and dangerous, respectively, include such chemicals as mercury, arsenic, cyanide, and asbestos. So some of the most dangerous things, although not radioactive, that could be stored there. This is the first and last underground storage facility that is authorized to store some of these class 0 substances, which would be the most dangerous. And considerations over the gallery's long-term stability, especially in the light of apparent mismanagement that led to the chemical reaction that led to the fire, raise concerns um, about what to do with the waste, and further serving as a continuation of some of the concerns that were brought up even at the project's establishment, which led to the 30-year mark. However, now the 30 years becomes a question of, is it safe to go down to the galleries and remove this waste? Is it not? For example, the MDPA has removed 95% of the mercury stored there, but 5 of it is still remaining, and 42 of the 44 metric tons are still stored in the galleries. And currently, the MDPA and government-led effort argues for complete confinement permanently of the waste currently stored there. The second part of this, and perhaps the most important one, really, is civil society in France more generally. To make sure that there is a clear understanding of what this is, I want to emphasize that civil society is the so-called third sector of society that exists outside of public and private sectors. In EU law, civil society organization is defined as an organizational structure whose members serve the general interest through a democratic process and which plays the role of mediator between public authorities and citizens. This definition stands on additional research, both in the realm of French civil society, but also in the role that has been historically played by civil society organizations in the context of mining operations and the storage of extractive waste. For example, a 2017 analysis by Aydin and others states that as the number of civil society organizations or CSOs involved in a conflict increased, the outcome was more likely to be perceived as a success in terms of environmental justice. Additionally, they found that if a civil society organization was connected to other central civil society organizations, that is to say, there was a clearly established network, the average perception of environmental justice success was likely to increase as well. This general scholarship of what it takes for a civil society organization to be effective is something that I will be emphasizing again as I talk about the 3 key players I looked at. Of course, another important consideration is, what does civil society in France itself look like? Here, I want to extrapolate on the work done by Archambault and Pertot, who emphasize multiple periods, multiple stages in the timeline of the development of civil society in France that are of particular importance to them. The first of these was the passage in 1901 of an act on free association that legalized civil society as a concept. Throughout the 19th century, French history, civil societies were needed to any civil society organization would need to be authorized prior to being formed. 1901 is the point that marks the possibility of these societies delivering freely in a more democratic society as we would define it and see it today. A second important mark specifically for this project comes in the period of Engelhart's silent revolution of the 1970s and 80s that has dual importance to this project. First, it is the rise of post-materialist values, so focus on issues that exist outside of the economic and material sphere, such as the freedom of movement or immigration, and the environment. Of course, environmental considerations are the primary concern here, and secondly, it sees the rise of cause-based CSOs. So instead of simply working in hospitals or providing beds and so on, CSOs are now increasingly fighting for causes and representing interests of various groups in the context of whatever the event may be. Lastly, The 21st century has increasingly seen, according to the same analysis, decentralization of power in French politics, meaning that local governments have gained more control over local issues than they have had in the past. In the context of civil society, this has meant a risk of CSO instrumentalization, meaning that local governments are more likely to see CSOs as tools that they can use to implement certain policy goals, meaning further integration of CSOs into local governance while rendering them, well, lessening some of the degree of agency that they might have had in other circumstances. So this is the theoretical political context in which the present study stands. Going into the research itself, one of the first groups that I looked at was the work and the publications put out by Rue 89 Strasbourg, and specifically journalist Thibaut Viter, who has been investigating the facility since 2021. Oh, geez. Of course, journalism is important in any democratic society. It is a source of information. It's a way to inform the general public on what is going on. Specifically, investigative journalism serves a particular purpose here, as some of Viter's work has resulted in far closer than had been done before, at least publicly, and with the goal of disseminating the findings, research on the documents stored in MDPA archives about the period when the facility was first organized, the fire, and everything else. Some of the key parts of the document analysis and the anonymous interviews with some of the workers revealed that first, the incoming waste was not tested in its entirety, instead was very selectively tested, meaning that there is not a guarantee that it entirely fits the criteria of admission to the facility. Secondly, some of the interviewees mentioned that there is potentially radioactive waste stored in the facility as well. This investigative approach is very different from a more punitive framework that might have been undertaken by the courts in the immediate outfall of the fire, trying to see who's responsible and what to do next. Instead, it is a focus on the causes of the situation. Further, as this is a journalistic effort, it is fundamentally rooted in an understanding of, okay, whatever information is discovered needs to be made public, meaning that society will be more informed and we'll have better and more reliable potential information. And again, newer information, as Viter has undertaken this is only 4 years ago, to rely upon. This also means that this will be more present in the public psyche as opposed to some event that happened over 20 years ago. Important to mention here is that it hasn't only been Rue 89 Strasbourg who has published on this issue. For example, France 3 Région Grand Est and other newspapers have also done extensive work on this. And you can see a clear correlation between these investigative pieces or pieces about other civil society organizations that are posted by these papers and consequent interviews done by politicians at the national or regional level that extend beyond Wittelsheim itself, and more attention at the greater political level being attracted to this situation as opposed to what is done when there is little investigative pressure on the site. The second group that I wanted to talk about was the Stocamine Collective, and here I want to refer yet again to Aydin's analysis that emphasized the role of a central organizing civil society organization. The Stocamine collects 15 associations and unions across France, Germany, and Switzerland. I mentioned previously this international context, as again, if the aquifer were to be polluted, it would clearly affect not just the residents of Wittelsheim and not just those in Alsace. It's also important, I believe, to mention that the unions represent some of the people working in mining, clearly situating this as well within the professional and the industry practices relevant to this. I also want to point to Stocamine in two key functions. First of these is the dissemination of information. Their website has a treasure trove of information about the Stocamine site. It includes not only articles and press releases archived and time-stamped, but is also regularly updated, but also specific interviews, legal analyses, that have been published by groups from throughout the region, of course, predominantly French, but also German and Swiss, focusing on this, meaning that if somebody were to want to find out more, if they would want to discover what they might not know, refresh their memory, see what's going on now, they would be able to easily access all of this information throughout the Destocking Collective's website. Secondly, is this organizing function that is emphasized in the title slide. Where again, I'm referring to identity analysis I mentioned earlier, where instead of acting in parallel with each other, these groups are able to cooperate, share resources, and share their knowledge and skills and the power held in their members' hands and the labor to reach their goals, including organizing protests and media coverage in tandem with one another, as opposed to doing the same thing, but in a more dissociated way, maybe paralleling one another's actions and doing the work twice over. This has meant that most of the coverage that comes mentions at least one of the Stocamine Collective's members and refers to its website and their materials to contextualize the broader debate, even when the sources themselves may be opposed to their goal of destocking the galleries. One of such members of the Destocking Collective is Alsace Nature. Alsace Nature is a legal group. It is defined here as a civil society organization due to its combined voluntary and only few paid members labor force. They have been the key group to bring about legal challenges to MDPA over the past several decades. And they have also been the ones to, for example, push for the partial removal of the mercury that I mentioned earlier. More recently, a lot of their work has focused on connecting the dangers posed to the environment and to the humans who inhabit this area and their quality of life in the future. For example, one of the recent examples of this was their 2024 appeal to the European Court of Human Rights to stop the decision made by the local French government to indefinitely confine this waste to this facility. So essentially to keep it sealed there permanently, which, as I will have you recall, the 30-year initial timeline does not follow this. And as the groups have been fighting for, they believe that full destocking would be the safer option, which is supported by some of the geophysical analysis. And Alsace Nature has also emphasized the value of at least more increased destocking and removal of more waste than has been removed, as well as the nature of the polluter pays principle that is present in EU law and environmental considerations. So to summarize the findings, I've adopted 3 key framing tools. One of these was the geographical location as something that cannot be easily changed by humans or changed at all in many ways, but has to be considered and has to be adapted to, as the human environment relationship is foundational to any such process. Second was a temporal evolution and the accident entrance of multiple groups, be they governmental or civil society organizations. And finally, looking at civil society organizations as actors and analyzing what it is that they have been doing to achieve their goal of instituting greater controls on the facility and potentially full destocking, which would be the best solution to the situation in their view. Speaking of which, the key CSO action types that I have analyzed have been dissemination of information in the form of journalism or in the form of making it accessible for journalists and others, as with the Stocamine Collective. Secondly, organizing. This is specifically the case of the Stocamine Collective and allowing resource sharing. In an international context, this is also very important consideration. And finally, bringing about legal challenges as these decisions are made on an executive basis and encouraging that level of democratic accountability that may have been otherwise absent, serving a very important role of what civil society does. I mentioned before the increased national and regional level attention that has been brought about by these actions, to the degree that the Stocamine facility was meant to be a specifically indicated line item in the ill-fated late 2024 French national budget. And this has been, the civil society's actions have indisputably been a shaping force in how the Stockamine facility is not only perceived, but in how it's managed and how it will be managed going forward. The present stage has seen an ongoing law case that at the time of the presentation's recording is still in the courts and has been undecided concerning whether it will be indefinitely confined or removed partially, and so on, coming in the light of some of the scientific analyses that treat the gallery's current state as unstable, and others citing the delay as a great cost for the French taxpayer and for the local governments. However, none of this would have been as prolonged and as a dedicated and passionate a fight without the structures and the civil society groups that I have been discussing throughout this. Finally, as I wrap up my presentation, I think it's also important to add another consideration to this French governance discussion, which is the EU level. For EU member states, most environmental legislation originates at the EU level. At the point of the facility's origination, the EU Landfill Directive was the main governing document. Since then, the Extractive Waste Directive has been adopted, which was created as all other EU directives with stringent consultation procedures. And importantly, as all other EU directives, it refers to the national government's competencies and their regular means of enacting EU law in adopting this directive and transposing international law and using the groups and levels of government that they deem to be applicable and worthwhile for the directive's implementation. Importantly, the directive has come under increased criticism, not in the least because of the Stockamine facility. In fact, an analysis from the early 2010s specifically refers to the Stockamine facility as an example of why further detail must be added to it or why it must be altered. In 2024, Transport and Environment further launched a legal analysis that's found, quote, a significant risk of fragmentation in the implementation of the Extractive Waste Directive and a failure to meet best available techniques and insufficient protection of the environment and local communities. This further resulted in an open letter signed by several NGOs in January of 2025. So again, there is that civil society connection. This comes at a time not so long after the adoption of the EU Critical Raw Materials Act, which is meant to incentivize more mining for critical raw materials in the European Union, especially intended for renewable energy. Although potash is not on the list, it is important to understand that extractive waste storage methods are in many ways, of course, it depends on the level of toxicity and the threat posed by the chemicals, but in many ways they're uniform, meaning that the considerations about the Extractive Waste Directive in the context of Stockamine would also apply to how this directive is suitable to upholding the level of stress put on the mining industry by the Critical Raw Materials Act. And finally, to sum it all up, I mentioned previously the Critical Raw Materials Act and its impact. And as new policies evolve, we must take past precedent in all EU member states, as Stockamine has been compared to several facilities in other EU countries, in adopting policies that in the future are informed by these, but also potentially amending current laws to make sure that they account for past failures. On environmental considerations, it is the Upper Rhine Rift, so the Upper Rhine Plain, as I mentioned, is home to one of the largest aquifers in Europe. It is already highly polluted due to a lot of mining and a lot of agricultural activity taking place in this region, and definitionally, the Stockamine facility poses a disproportionate risk of contamination. And for example, an analysis that came out just last month by Comber and Favier emphasized just this. And the fact that if precautions are taken, it is possible to minimize or even remove the risk of contamination, including mercury contamination altogether, while present measures taken to safeguard the galleries and make them more stable are not sufficient. And further, the International Atomic Energy Agency has compared the Stockamine site to the CGO facility, which would be also in France, which would store radioactive waste. That compares it directly to the experience of Stockamine as another site that has been highly contentious and has potentially posed a great risk, thereby informing these environmental policies and decisions on past experience because it has been pushed to the front and has been so extensively emphasized by these civil society organizations. And finally, human rights. I mentioned the polar pace principle previously, and increasingly the post-materialist focus in the European political sphere has meant an equation of environmental harm and human rights, or rather harm to the environment and harm to the human quality of life and human rights. However, this does not appear to be as extensively reflected in the law, certainly not as in relation to the Stockamine facility. I mentioned the decision of the ECHR in response to the Alsace Nature appeal. This also comes at a time when one of the most recent out of the relevant rulings at the French level, 2011 defined harm as harm caused to particular persons, meaning that a hypothetical contamination of water that would not be targeting any particular persons, at least not in the arguments that have been laid out so far, would not fall under this definition of harm. These are all dynamics that have emerged throughout the Stockamine facilities, the discussion on the Stockamine facility, as well as its framing and the concerns about it and the tensions surrounding this question. I believe that the Stockamine facility's importance to the local community and the emphasis placed on it by civil society organizations is truly a very prominent and important case of a democracy at work, of a democracy that has to take into consideration environmental aspects and how humans exist within the environment, what it is that we can and cannot do, should and should not do, and what are the powers we have in affecting these decisions and enacting them. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and that concludes my presentation.